On this episode of Doing the Most, we're going to wash our yeast so we can use it in another batch of mead.
Homemade brews and various how-tos, everything from mead to roast, bake creation, fermentation, inebriation, doing the most.
Recently, we released a video about this hopped lemongrass mead. Well, in this video, we're going to show you how to wash the yeast so you can use it in another batch of mead. Now, just a note, this segment was featured in a mead bread recipe recently on this channel. The link to that video will be in the description of this video. So the first thing we've got to do is rack the mead off of the gross lees and yeast cake. I'm going to walk you through the basics of yeast washing. Yeast washing can be used to salvage yeast from a batch, yeast that has grown and evolved and mutated as it has fermented your mead, and you can harvest that yeast off and use it in another batch. You could easily take this washed yeast, pitch it into your next batch of mead, and start brewing with it again. You can do this innumerable times, however, the yeast will mutate and evolve as it goes from batch to batch. So eventually you might get some undesirable results. So for yeast washing, we are going to start with 4 sanitized mason jars, and we're going to shake the lees up really strong so that way it's all mixed together, and divide it relatively evenly among these 4 jars. In that Dutch oven there is some water that had been brought to a boil and then allowed to cool to room temperature. We're going to top each of these jars up with some of that sanitary water, being careful to spill enough so that you can mop later, and then we'll seal each of those jars up, shake them so they're nice and well mixed, and then let them sit for 30 minutes. In this time lapse, you can actually see the gross lees start to settle to the bottom, and on top of that a thin white line forms. That is yeast starting to settle out, and so now we know that the water on top is yeasty water. That's where all the yeast are that we are going to harvest for our yeast washing. It is of note that you should be very careful and slow and deliberate as you are doing this process because you don't want to disturb the gross lees at the bottom. There's nothing really useful in there, so we don't want to harvest that off. We're just pouring that yeasty water from one jar into another sanitized jar and then stopping before we get to the gunk at the bottom. So 4 jars will eventually become 2 jars of yeasty water. And then those are going to go into the refrigerator and cold crash for 24 hours. And then we'll come back and pour the liquid off. So here we are 24 hours later. I have a nice hard cider, homemade, and you can see the separation here, particularly the water on top, the yeast, and the lees. And then that other jar is almost entirely yeast at the bottom. So now, carefully again, we will pour off all of the water and discard that, and the yeast at the bottom is what we will use to ferment our batch. Now, I want to make a point here. You can do another cycle of washing here and very gently suction up the water with like a turkey baster, and then suction up the yeast from that, and then put that yeast into some more sanitary clean like spring water, shake it up real good, put that in the fridge and let it settle again, and then you will have even less lees carry over in your washed yeast from that jar. So now you've got a batch of washed yeast. This can be pitched into your next batch, and this can be used several times before it starts to mutate and potentially develop off flavors. There are some breweries that have been reusing their yeast over and over and over again for years and decades, and they can really contribute an interesting character to the beers that kind of make them their own. Thank you for watching this video. If you have any questions about this process, hit me up in the comments. Otherwise, we hope you'll follow us on Instagram and Pinterest, and as you know, you can check us out at doingthemost.org. Thanks for watching. Hope you'll hit that subscribe button. We'll see you next time.